Welcome to Means of Grace, a podcast produced by the Western North Carolina Conference of the United Methodist Church.
Thanks for joining us for the Means of Grace podcast today. I am Amy Yeager, the Conference Director of Communications, and I am excited to introduce a podcast from one of our conference churches. We are going to hear a guest episode from the Curious Living podcast, which is hosted by Reverend Monica Humple at Williamson's Chapel United Methodist Church in Mooresville. The Curious Living podcast is sponsored and produced by Williamson's Chapel United Methodist Church. And in the podcast, they explore their curious questions and unpack these curiosities through the lens of Scripture and our Christian faith. Through thoughtful and engaging interviews with neighbors, pastors, and experts, Reverend Humple walks us through some common and some challenging questions while valuing individual perspectives along the way. Perhaps these curious conversations will spark the same holy curiosity in you. Today's guest episode is the 50th episode for the Curious Living podcast. And in this episode, we will hear from an incredibly brave woman who endured a devastating tragedy. She not only endured, but she grew closer to God and found an incredible hope throughout her experience. And she shares all of this with us in this episode. So I hope that you will listen in and enjoy this guest episode from the Curious Living podcast. After the episode, be sure to go and find this podcast, give them a like and a follow. We'll also link to their show in our show notes from today's episode. And with that, I'll hand it over to Reverend Humple.
Welcome to the Curious Living podcast, where we embrace our holy curiosity through engaging conversation. I'm your host, Monica Humple.
Hello, friends, and welcome to this episode of the Curious Living podcast. I'm so excited you have chosen to join us for this episode. We have kind of a deep, curious question today, one that I think many of us have probably rolled around a little bit, especially when the bad stuff's happening in our life. And here's the curious question we are going to tackle with our guest today. Can good things really come from bad things? I mean, can they really? And we might be asking that question in the middle of the bad thing, wondering, okay, well, this is not fun. I don't like this. This is uncomfortable, or this is very painful. But can good things really come from bad things? And the guest I chose for this topic, I believe, can truly speak to this. I chose her for this very purpose because she's experienced bad things. And she has been able to find good things. And I know she was an inspiration to me when I read about her. And I believe she is going to be the same for you. So let's just welcome our guest on this episode of the Curious Living podcast, Debbie Baisden. Welcome. We're so glad you're here.
Thank you. It's such a privilege, and I'm truly honored. So thank you.
Awesome. So, I don't want to speak on your behalf, but I would love it if you would tell us a little bit about you.
So I am a former school teacher who became a mom of 4 within 4 years. So 4 boys in 4 years, just this whole litter of children. So I transitioned from school teacher to stay-at-home mom. And while I was a stay-at-home mom and the boys were super little, my husband unexpectedly passed away. And it brought such devastation that I didn't know how life would be able to move forward in our now much smaller family, but I have been able to stay vertical. I didn't implode and have been able to experience the goodness of God, like you mentioned, in such significant and dramatic ways ever since that moment. So here I am today.
Well, your story is powerful. And friends listening right now, just letting you know, I'm going to link her website to you so that you can read some of this for yourself. It is a powerful, and we'll probably hear more about that in just a minute as she answers some questions. So, all right, Debbie. So based on your personal experience that you just shared, you lost your husband, a young mom of 4 young children. How hard was it for you to find hope in this time of grief? I mean, could you in it, when you were in it, could you actually see good in that moment? Or did you see the good later? I mean, what was your personal experience in that?
Right. So my husband went missing for 40 hours and I had to file a missing person report. It was a very movie-like experience. I felt like I was on a movie set with calling the police, search dogs being brought in. They were calling in helicopters with thermal imaging to try to find my husband because they could only find his car. They had called in this rookie team. Friends and family were looking for him. And so I think, even before I knew the devastation on the horizon, I was still holding on to hope pre-grief. I'm holding out, like, surely everything is going to be fine, which it was not. He was found dead in the woods after 40 hours. He had fallen from a tree while working on his deer stand, and I have to assume lost his balance. He was not strapped in, so lots of safety things were ignored. But that was such a blind side. You want to talk about the rug being pulled out from underneath you. I had never felt the depth of such horrific pain in my life. And as I'm sitting at the scene, which actually is a crime scene when there's no witnesses and there's detectives and investigators, as I'm sitting there trying to process what the police officer has told me of, I'm sorry to tell you, your husband is dead. I think in those initial moments, I was so paralyzed. I was so numb. I could not really process any emotion on any spectrum. It was just like you're floating in space almost. And so I think I very quickly had an internal conversation with God, thinking, you allowed this. You are sovereign. You are not surprised. You're seated on your throne. I know that my husband, Aaron, is alive with you, though there is this wide chasm of separation, but I have to surrender to you at this point. My faith has to be so immovable that I'm putting all my eggs in your basket, God. And so at first, the brutality, I think, pushed away even the chance of having hope. I did not know how I would breathe. I did not know how I would move. And knowing I only had a few hours before I had to then tell our little boys, who were ages 4, 7, and 8 at the time, to even conceptualize the idea of hope with the 5 of us moving forward, it was too abstract. It was too far-fetched. And so, no, I don't think I initially had hope. However, the great turning point is, I think, incrementally, almost unnoticeably over time, the hope started to resurface. Just a very, if you picture like the graph with the line just very slightly going forward, not quite a plateau, but definitely not a mountain spike. I think because the Lord kept ministering to my heart. He kept meeting me where I was every step of the way through all the pain and the funeral and writing an obituary and still having to parent. All of these moments I think the gift of time is, as the numbness and shock lessened and reality started to replace it, I think there started to be little strobe lights of hope that started to come. And then as even more time would pass, you kind of zoom out to the 20,000 foot view. I think it was no longer a strobe light, but just a longer stretch, maybe not a bright light, maybe still dim, but more of a constant of God is the God of hope. God literally is hope itself. And so if I have God, then I do have hope.
Oh, that's so beautiful. So kind of a secondary or third part question to that, though. Well, let me just lean into my next question, because I think you're going to answer this in my next question. What good things specifically came from your experience of losing your husband? Now, I want to give a caveat here, because I've been through, now I have not lost a husband to death, but I have been through affair recovery. Okay. My husband had an affair, traumatic, grief-stricken, very long, hard road. And that's actually who I coach in my coaching business, are women who are choosing to stay in their marriage following an affair. It is hard. It is not easy. And the grief is very heavy. And having hope that you could ever have a happy marriage on the other side of that, like you just described, is exactly how I felt. I was in this dark tunnel, and every now and then I get a flash of light. But sometimes it's dark again. And then it's like, and I remember, the first time I said to somebody, when my marriage actually is better now than it was before the affair, because of all the work, we're so intentional now where we were not before. So we've changed, we've evolved. So when I said to someone that, and I don't know how I said it, but I said, had that not happened, I wouldn't have this good thing. And they looked at me like I had four heads and said, "You're glad he had an affair?" I'm like, what? No, it's not what I'm saying. If I could have gotten to this place any other way, yeah, sure. But that's not the life I'm living. That's not my reality. My reality is this bad thing happened to me. And instead of looking at it like it was a curse, what came from it has become a blessing. And that's a very different thing. So I want to quantify what I just asked you, because I'm not asking by any way, shape, or form that you're glad your husband died. Absolutely not. And I know you know what I'm asking. I want to make sure I think my audience understands what I'm asking here. Not in a million years would I ever ask you, "Hey, so all these good things happened. Are you really glad?" No, not one day. I think, will you ever say, "I'm so glad that happened." But what I'm more pointing to, and I see, okay, you guys can't see this. She's nodding. She gets me. But what I'm more pointing to is the experience that you had no choice but to endure: the grief, the growth, the awareness, the openness. Most likely, if you were anything like me, your faith deepened to a level you just did not know was possible. Or if you're anything like me, you fluctuated. I went from being really mad at God and didn't want to talk to God for a few days to then all of a sudden I'm God's BFF. And then we were just like, I was back and forth because I was going through so many emotions. I didn't know how I felt sometimes, but my faith through that tension, through that struggle really grew. So all of that stuff. So I'll ask the question again, because again, thank you for letting me quantify it. I want to make sure feel like, oh, that's a horrible thing. Why are you asking her that? But I think you understand what I'm asking, Debbie. So what good thing came from your experience of losing your husband? And the second part of that is it, or has it ever been hard for you to have actual gratitude for these good things in light of what you've lost? Can you talk to us about that?
Yeah, I think I do think I'll kind of answer in reverse order almost, because I think while in that midst of healing, I think it was an ebb and flow of trying to mine those silver linings. And often there was this longing, this theme of Aaron should be here. Aaron should be here for this. Aaron should be in this limo ride as we're going to the church for the funeral. And then you're like, oh, wow, that's insane. So I never doubted the goodness of God, but more had a renewed awe of his sweetness. I'm not against or judging anybody who has dealt with the anger phase. I never seem to have the anger phase specifically, but I think everybody is so different. But I love the question because it's worth reflecting on, even whether we are in a current dark valley or even have the ability, thanks to time, to look back to past dark times and say, what good did come of that? I have had waves of hardship in my life. And so I think it's worth looking behind us, which propels us to the future of he's got it. If he was faithful in the past and he's faithful now, I think he'll probably continue to be faithful. So I think, like you mentioned, there became only through this pain, this full reliance on God as all in all, not a sometimes when you're convenient reliance, but a fully surrendered on my face, palms up and empty reliance on him. Like, you are real. You are not this felt pad Sunday school Jesus. You're everything, Jesus. And I think I learned how much I had idolized my husband, how much I had probably been codependent on my husband, meet all my needs, make me happy. Yep. You're filling all the voids in my life. And then to no longer have that was necessary so that I could have this unwavering relationship with Christ for everlasting contentment. I'm like, this is what you designed. This is how it's actually supposed to operate. And I kept messing it up and getting in the way. So with that happiness or joy, whatever you want to call it, because if we're supposed to rejoice through trials and have this joy because we are believers, I learned how to rethink what is happiness, because I'm surrendering to the Lord who created and rejuvenated me. And so instead of these circumstantial smiles that I could have, it's much more deep seated to say, wait a minute, like, even if the darkness comes, even if my worst fears become reality, even if fill in the blank, I want to rely on you. And if I had kept on in my convenient complacency with Aaron being alive and everything is suburbia and great and easy enough, I don't know that I could have had that. So I think that pain has purpose, and one of them is to refine us. He's like, you've got so much garbage mixed in. So I'm going to turn up the heat the same way, it is like with the metals being purified. You have to turn up the heat in order to skim off the grossness, the self-reliance, the quote unquote independence, all of these things. And he's like, the goal, Debbie, is to make you more like me. And so I think one aspect I've noticed once more time had passed was the ability to be more compassionate, probably as if the way that you're able to coach so many women through pain, because you can relate to it.
Yeah, empathy. Yeah.
You're right there in the same plane as these other families who are facing such devastation, and to say, no, I hear you. I see you. I've been there. I can experience, instead of outsiders who are kind of like, it sounds really sad. It sounds really hard. And you're like, yeah, but that's not really encouraging. So I like that I don't like that there are other widows, but I like the ability to encourage people, even if they're not walking through, coordinating a funeral. I still want to be a source of encouragement, because I've been greatly encouraged by the Lord and people as well. And I think once Aaron died, I did struggle with, where is my significance coming from? Because it was like wife, feed my love tank. And now no one's there to feed my love tank.
Right.
And I'm like, oh my word, I was trying to make my husband into a God, if we're being honest. And so to actually read the book, Search for Significance, to say, wait a minute, I get everything from God? Who does he say I am? And who am I supposed to be in response to that? So my hope is that some good that's come from this is I can love better, especially my family. I hope, I don't know, they probably say it differently. But
No.
as I've realized the magnitude and sovereignty of God, I want there to be a much more aligned obedience. Like, who do you want me to be? How can I serve? How can I reflect you and witness to others about you ultimately? So when you say, yeah, death is horrible, but look at all these treasures that God has been good and gracious enough to gift me, that I didn't deserve any of that. That's just his goodness overflowing. It's actually a list that I could probably keep going on. It would be like a 12-hour show.
I love that so much. So, and I agree with absolutely everything you said. We are always being refined, and God is doing powerful work in us, even through the bad stuff. And that is amazing. Now, people listening right now, maybe going through some bad stuff. And it could be many things. It doesn't have to necessarily be death. They could have just lost their job. They might have just gotten that horrible diagnosis, or someone they loved did, or there could be something going on that is clouding. Because my guess is you and I are doing pretty good right now. So we can sit here and talk about this and, good. Oh, it's going to be okay, because we're not in the bad right now. Or at least I'm assuming, Debbie. I shouldn't assume you're in, because y'all can't see her like I can, but she's got this beautiful smile. She's got this sunny disposition. So I shouldn't make assumptions. I apologize if you are actually going through bad stuff right now. But I think sometimes it's easy for us, not in the middle of it, to say, yeah, to lean on God and God will help you. And, it's not as black and white as that. And I think you and I, in our own personal experience, have seen that. But I believe, though, based on your experiences, that maybe you could have some good advice for these folks who are in the middle of the bad and having a really hard time recognizing God's presence, really having a hard time recognizing the good things. Because when we are in the middle of the bad, or even people who by their own personality tend to carry the negative, they claim the negative, and they tend to not claim the good, because the negative overshadows everything. And so anyone like that, anyone who's just suffering right now and are having a hard time recognizing the good things, what would you say to them? Because you're a coach. I mean, so if they were listening right now, what advice would you give them? And what helped you? Like, share your own personal experience when you maybe were struggling to see the good, or maybe in hindsight, you look back and go, ooh, there was a lot of good. I just couldn't see it. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, that's really well said. It is sometimes, I think the 2020 does bring more clarity. I think I would encourage people, even though you don't want to ask other people for help. I know that we all, I think in this society, we're like, I don't want to bother people. I don't want to be a burden. I think people who are aware of your struggles really are yearning to help. They're like, put us to work. We're ready. Say the word. And I had never experienced the body of Christ ever like I had in weeks, months. It was surreal. It did not seem real, the way that people would pitch in and help. And so I think to tell people, you have to acknowledge, like, hey, I'm at the bottom of the pit and there's no ladder. Somebody help me. So I think that's a really hard thing to do. It's hard to admit we need help and to ask for it, let that idea of burdensome asking go away. So to let people help, I had so many people who were like, we're going to take your kids to a movie. We'll bring them back in 2 hours. They will be fed. Do whatever you want to do in this time. We're not telling you how to spend the 2 hours. They will be cared for. Or people would send a gift card for fast food because I couldn't possibly put a meal together, to ask people for help. And alongside that, to ask the Lord. All I could say in those initial hours, days, and weeks was Jesus, help. I remember sitting in my husband's car, parked in the driveway, clutching the steering wheel with my forehead against the steering wheel, just wailing, feeling very hopeless, feeling so overcome with, I don't know how I'm going to do this. And I've got 4 people that are relying on me for livelihood. In those moments, all I could say was, Jesus, help. And that was enough. It didn't have to be this eloquent, like, hello, thy Father, I come contrite. It's just like,
that's right.
That's all I could muster within me. And he is closer than a whisper. I think before Aaron died, my Bible time was superficial. My prayer time was rushed. That stuff shifted dramatically. So I think even though it may take energy and work and intention to really have prayer time on your knees out loud, spending time reading God's word, because that's the standard of truth, right? Instead of what the world says of like, pull yourself up by your bootstraps and
that's right.
Yeah. What does God say? What is his word saying about pain, about death, about sorrow, about who he is with his character? That was very helpful to be reminded, because I did not want emotions to be driving the bus. I wanted God to drive the bus. So it's like, I'm not going to focus on my feelings. I want to focus on my faith, because feelings are too fickle and unpredictable and always shifting like shadows. So I think I had to remind myself, like I mentioned, recalling how he had been faithful in the past. And therefore, that must mean he has to be faithful in the future. And along with that, reading the Bible about his faithfulness, how it is a constant theme through those people's real lives. And I mentioned the book, Search for Significance. I'm not bound to that. I'm not loyal to that book. But for me, when my friends and I, my close girlfriends and I read that book together, again, that's recruiting people, please help me and be here with me in my loneliness. But it was also the reinforcement of, I needed something practical and tangible to say, remember, this is all a good reminder of how our lives are supposed to be lived, where our eyes are heavenward. Instead of looking for other people and circumstances to bring us joy, it's like, no, I want the constant joy, even when times are beyond brutal. And like this whole podcast is about, finding those silver linings, which is hard maybe in the moment, but I really tried to reflect regularly, like, what is some good that's coming with this? Could I honestly say a better relationship with God is a down? No, that's a positive for sure. So I think looking for those things of like, yes, this is hard. However, always having the however attached to the end. And honestly, I think it takes time. Someone the other day had said, oh, well, you just kind of gloss over your story. Like, oh, well, I love this ministry and, oh, death is sad, but oh, well, no. That I'm at to the point where I'm well over 10 years past that initial pain. And God is so good. He insulated me with numbness at the beginning where I really felt paralyzed. But then over time, some of that numbness and insulation wears off into this is real. So I'm going to expose, some hurt and all of those things. I try to tell people when they're like, if they've lost a spouse, lost a job, whatever your fill in the blank moment is of this is the biggest trial of my life, to say it won't always feel like it does today.
Yeah,
I'm not saying time heals all wounds and it'll get better and you'll get over it. I'm saying it won't always feel like this, because I did not know where to get my next breath in those initial. Going to the mailbox was a huge field trip for me. And so to say there is hope, that the darkness will lift if you're plugged into the source of life. In and of yourself, if you're not following Christ, that I can't speak to that. That wasn't my experience. And so I think, I was thinking of a couple of verses from Psalm 28, and verses 6-8 say, praise be to the Lord, for he has heard my cry for mercy. The Lord is my strength and my shield. My heart trusts in him and I am helped. My heart leaps for joy and I will give thanks to him in song. The Lord is the strength of his people, a fortress of salvation for his anointed one. I mean, what? Just those 3 verses. It's like, cry out to him. He can handle it. He can take it and he can really transform and have that beauty come from the ashes. So that's probably a really long answer to such a short question.
No, actually, that's wonderful. And you've touched on a lot of really great points. And we carry grief forever. We don't get over it. We don't wake up one day and just forget it happened. But the beautiful transformation that takes place through the grief process. And I do believe that's how we're created. That's how God created us, to get through something hard. Like you said, cocoons us at first, opens us up a little bit. But it does it over that process, if you will. We see those silver linings. We start to see. And I love that you mentioned people. I believe that God shows up and the good shows up a lot of times, not from something we're doing, but from how someone else is stepping alongside us, what someone else is doing, or even a transformation in another person can be a powerful thing in the midst of something bad. And, to be aware of that and to be open, which is really what I hear you saying is to be aware, to be open to that movement and be looking for it, seeking it, right? So I love that. Thank you for that. This is a special topic for me, and you have really stepped into it in a beautiful way. Debbie, thank you so much. I know your story is vulnerable. It's sharing something very deep and was very painful for you. And I'm sure even today, I mean, again, grief doesn't necessarily fade away. We just become stronger and better able to carry it. So I recognize that. So I know it's not super easy to talk about that. Thank you for being so vulnerable and open with our audience. I really appreciate it.
Oh, it really is a pleasure for me. Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, I have one more question before we wrap up. I ask this of all of my guests. It's a fun question, and I'm curious what you're going to say. But here's the question. What are you curious about today?
I love it. I love this. I love this whole theme. Honestly, I'm gonna be vulnerable and authentic. I'm a huge fan of transparency. I can't ever be superficial. I'm just not wired that way. So I am curious if one of my 4 sons, right? So my 4 boys are now 15, 17, and 19, just FYI. One of my kids does not believe in God. And I think as a tiny little toddler, it was a yes. I know the brain is a little bit less developed than being a teenage brain. I am curious on if he ever will accept Jesus as his savior, if he will ever have the idea that he is a sinner in need of a savior. That is something that I am very curious about and eagerly anticipate a good outcome.
Yes. Well, and I know, and thank you for being vulnerable with us. I love your transparency and appreciate it, because I'm sure other mamas and daddies listening to this may be experiencing something similar. But as parents, what do? We give it to God, right?
Yes.
Salvation is something the Holy Spirit works in and through us. And we trust in that. We lean on that. So keep praying, Mama.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And those of you listening right now, hey, thanks for giving your time to listening to this episode of the Curious Living Podcast. Again, thank you for listening to any of our episodes. They drop on the first of the month. So make sure you catch us next month on the first day of the month as well. And friends, I close out our episodes the same way every single time, and I will do it again. Never lose your holy curiosity.
thank you for listening to Means of Grace, a podcast produced by the Western North Carolina Conference of the United Methodist Church. We hope you enjoy listening to these podcasts and use them as a way to stay connected to our community. Remember to subscribe to Means of Grace for free on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Please leave us an honest rating and a review. It helps others find this podcast. Follow the WNCC on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at WNCCUMC. Once again, that's at WNCCUMC. Means of Grace is produced by the Western North Carolina Conference of the United Methodist Church and Andy Go of Gojo Studios.